Chairman, let me begin with two paradoxes. As we've just heard from Anton, and as we know, the main progress on nuclear disarmament has been achieved as a result of bilateral US, Soviet/Russian treaties and measures. But a nuclear weapon-free world, the theme of this conference, will have to rest on a legally binding international instrument such as a nuclear weapon convention. So how do we make the transition from the first to the second? A second paradox. The existing treaty-based regimes have anchored international security and can be credited with many major successes and significant achievements. However, almost all, if not all of them, show a lengthening list of accumulating anomalies, shortcomings, and some have perhaps reached the limits of their potential. This then raises the paradoxical challenge, if you like, of the need to supplement and perhaps go beyond the existing treaty-based regimes without in the meantime undermining them and jeopardizing the security that is based on the regimes. This paradox is inherent to the topic, and I'll discuss it with regard to four cuts: nuclear security regimes, nuclear weapon-free zone regimes, CTBT, and NPT, in that order. As Bill Porter reminded us yesterday, the nuclear security regime consists of a web of agreements, regulations, resolutions, and guidelines, including Security Council Resolution 1540. There are three main global treaty regimes underpinning nuclear security. The Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials establishes measures related to the physical protection of nuclear material during international transport, and a general framework of cooperation among states in the protection, recovery, and return of stolen nuclear material. A major amendment adopted by consensus in 2005 requires states parties to protect nuclear facilities and material in peaceful domestic use, storage, and transport. And the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, ICSANT, seeks to do three things: to protect against attacks on a broad range of nuclear targets, punish the perpetrators through domestic criminalization of acts of nuclear terrorism, and promote international cooperation in the prevention and investigation of acts of nuclear terrorism and the prosecution or extradition of alleged terrorists, the prosecute or extradite regime. The CPPNM has 149 states parties as of a month ago, which means that about 1/4 of the world's states have still not acceded to it. A month ago, only 73 of the 99 accessions needed for the 2005 amendment to enter into force have been received, so it's not yet entered into force. ICSANT did come into effect in 2007, but remains far from universal. A total of 115 nations have signed and 92 have ratified. In other words, again, as Bill told us yesterday, gaps in the existing national and multilateral machinery of nuclear security include lack of universality, binding standards, lack of transparency and accountability mechanisms, lack of compulsory IAEA oversight, and insufficient attention to nuclear weapons. I think at this conference I'm the only one presently actually living in the southern hemisphere, although Alan is originally from that part of the world as well. On nuclear weapon-free zone, let me remind you, virtually the entire southern hemisphere is now covered by nuclear weapon-free zones. It's a fact that very few people in the north register, and yet it's important. A nuclear weapon-free zone deepens and extends the scope of the NPT and embeds the non-nuclear weapon status of NPT states parties in additional treaty-based arrangements. Any such zone is characterized by 4 no's: no testing, possession, deployment, or use of nuclear weapons. And the very fact of negotiating them successfully is in itself a major confidence-building measure among regional states. That said, let me illustrate 2 problems. One, there is far from universal adherence by the nuclear armed states or nuclear weapon states to the protocols to these treaties. So it's an incomplete agenda. More importantly, the failure to convene the Middle East Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Conference points to certain significant limitations if we think of this as a panacea. For example, all existing zones have confirmed and consolidated the non-nuclear weapon status of regional countries. It's far from clear that new zones can be created as the means of achieving the denuclearization of an existing nuclear armed state, whether it be North Korea or Israel. Circumstances were particularly unpropitious in the Middle East, where key states are in a formal state of war and or non-recognition, convulsed in a brutal civil war, are not NPT members. They are hosts to nuclear weapons or for nuclear weapon states, for example, Turkey, are pursuing a breakout capability, or have already conducted several nuclear tests, as in North Korea. So let's recognize limitations that are again inherent to these proposals and not be unrealistically overambitious. CTBT. Embraced almost by the entire family of nations, but as a result of a remarkably stupid and self-defeating entry into force formula, 8 of the 44 Annex II countries are yet to ratify. And it seems to me the key countries in that are the United States, China, India, Pakistan. There seems to be no realistic prospect of ratification by the US Senate in the foreseeable future, and it seems unlikely that the others will move until such time as that would happen. And a related treaty-based regime that does not yet exist, but many deeply desire, and which has been referred to several times already at this conference, of course, is one that would prohibit additional production of fissile material for nuclear weapons use. So in other words, the FMCT. So the remaining half I want to focus on the NPT, having dealt with these three categories. And that's because, of course, the NPT is what I call the mother lode of all nuclear treaty-based regimes, embraced again by virtually an entire family of nations. But it does have many limitations and flaws. After all, the nuclear arsenals of what I call the N5, the 5 NPT listed nuclear weapon states, expanded enormously after the NPT was in force, peaked in the 1980s and has been falling since. The symbiotic link between non-proliferation and disarmament is integral to the NPT. A lack of progress on disarmament makes it more challenging to hold the line on non-proliferation. But any additional or suspected instance of proliferation also makes progress on disarmament much more difficult. And it seems to me that all parties need to accept the relationship between the three pillars of the NPT, which has kept the nuclear nightmare at bay for over 4 decades, while underpinning and facilitating the global trade in nuclear material for peaceful purposes. As we all know, there was a marked imbalance of obligations between the different bargains, hinted at delicately by the Prime Minister yesterday. The non-nuclear weapon status was immediate, legally binding, internationally verifiable, and enforceable. But there were no intrusive safeguards for the nuclear weapon states in their roles as suppliers of critical technology and components. More importantly, their commitment to disarm was neither timetabled, precise, nor binding. Within the constraints of the NPT, a non-nuclear industrialized country like Japan can build the necessary infrastructure to provide it with a surge capacity to upgrade quickly to nuclear weapons. By relying on the promise of signatories to use nuclear materials, facilities, and technology for peaceful purposes only, it empowered them to operate dangerously close to nuclear weapons capability, as the world has discovered with Iran. It proscribed non-nuclear states from acquiring nuclear weapons, but failed to design a strategy for dealing with non-signatory countries. It permits withdrawals much too easily, as North Korea did in 2003. It is impossible to deal with the non-NPT nuclear armed states from within the treaty. The order result, and I do want to highlight this because most people don't realize, the order result is that the 5 NPT illicit nuclear weapon states are legally obligated to disarm under Article 6 of the NPT, but India, Israel and Pakistan are not so legally obligated. It's those 5 that are in violation of the NPT obligations, not these 3. It's an order result, but I think it's worth highlighting that. And it also means that the non-NPT nuclear armed states cannot be asked to join the nuclear weapon-free zone protocols, even if they are regionally relevant. There are other problems with the NPT. The definition of a nuclear weapon state is chronological. A country that manufactured and exploded a nuclear device before 1st January 1967. This is Alice in Wonderland. Words mean what I mean, take them to me. The NPT may be creaking even with respect to its nuclear energy bargain, as the nexus of security, economic, energy and environmental imperatives, I think, can no longer be adequately nested within that one old regime. And so, the NPT anomalies and flaws mean that we need to look beyond and perhaps outside the treaty to realize the goal of nuclear elimination. But its very real, substantial and continuing contributions to international security mean that we must not jeopardize the regime until we are ready to replace it with a better, robust regime. If the non-proliferation end of the NPT bargain collapses, the regime becomes obsolete. If the Article 6 disarmament goal of the NPT is realized, the regime becomes redundant. There are 2 further critical risks. First, a significant number of countries, around 40, including NATO partners, Australia, Japan, South Korea, shelter under the nuclear umbrella of others to meet their perceived national security needs. With any hasty or premature dismantlement of the US nuclear stockpile, one or more of them could be tempted to break out and acquire an independent nuclear weapons capability. As someone who lived for a decade in Tokyo, this would be a genuine concern to me. It's not simply an abstract hypothetical concern. Second, in moving towards a world without nuclear weapons, we have to make sure that we do not tip back into a world that is safe once again for major power conventional wars like the First and Second World Wars. So again, major flaws and shortcomings. Perhaps the NPT has reached the limit of its potential. Either way, I think we need to look beyond that to how to get to a nuclear weapon-free world. In that, I think we have to remember that the most powerful stimulus to nuclear proliferation by others is the continuing possession of nuclear weapons by some. The problem is not nuclear proliferation, but nuclear weapons. They could not proliferate if they did not exist. Because they do, they will. In other words, the very fact of their existence in the arsenals of 9 countries is sufficient guarantee of their proliferation to others, and someday again use by design, mistake, miscalculation, rogue launch, system error, malfunction, whatever. Conversely, nuclear disarmament is a necessary condition of nuclear non-proliferation. And the policy implication of this logic is that if we want non-proliferation, we must prepare for disarmament with conviction, credibility, and a measure of transparency. Now, of course, the furphy is we cannot disinvent them. I don't think anyone argues that they can be disinvented. Neither can chemical weapons, neither can biological weapons. But like the other 2 in the WMD trilogy, nuclear weapons too can be controlled, regulated, restricted, and outlawed under an international regime that ensures strict compliance through effective and credible inspection and verification. As the Prime Minister said, this is not going to happen overnight. No one believes, no one argues for that. There are many technical issues of verification, legal challenges, political challenges, and operational challenges to be overcome. But the preparations on this must be begun now to identify all these challenges and point the way forward to overcoming the challenges, so that we do make the transition from a world in which the role of nuclear weapons is seen as central to maintaining national and international security, to one where they become progressively marginal and eventually unnecessary. Perfect timing before I get your note, Rakesh.